Spending a lot of time thinking about the economy, challenging dominant notions of the economy, thinking about economic alternatives, I really started wanting to question the category of the economy itself. And especially, there was a particular moment where I found myself giving a presentation about solidarity economy organizing, and I was saying to the people present, I was saying, it's not just about economic solidarity, it's also about social solidarity, and it's also about ecological solidarity. And as I was even saying that out loud, I found myself thinking in my head, what am I saying? I'm using these three categories: economy, society, environment. And I don't really know what I mean when I'm using these three categories. And some sense in which I thought there's something problematic about the whole distinction. Like what could possibly be economic that's not already social, that's not already ecological? What could possibly be social that's not already economic or ecological? Why is it so easy for me to talk about these three categories, but yet when I really start thinking about it, I have no idea what I'm saying? And then I started looking around and seeing a lot of people use these three categories, and almost nobody's defining them. And when we try and define them, they just slip through our fingers. And so it's really led me on a process of trying to unpack much more critically what's going on there. And I think here's sort of where I've come to at the moment, is that it's clear that the economy as a sort of, the idea of the economy as a thing that we're inside of, or as a thing that we have an economy and it is organized in a particular way, that idea is relatively recent. It seems clear to me that it was born sometime in the early to mid 19th century, really as a product of colonial industrial European capitalism. That it's only at the moment where a huge portion of humans have had many of their basic means of livelihood removed from them, no longer able to grow food for themselves, forced to work in ways where they have to leave the places they live to go to a separate place of employment, where there's a whole system of wages and money which is distinct from the work that happens in the household, the ongoing work of sustenance. Suddenly there's this disjuncture. And then we also have this process of a colonial capitalist market economy generating a whole set of supply and demand dynamics that are increasingly influencing people's lives. The economy is born at that moment where that's when people start actually talking about there being the economy, right? So I want to say that no humans prior to the 19th century actually had an economy, which sounds weird. We had ways of organizing our sustenance, but they didn't take the form of an economy until that was actually forcibly created. And in part created through the invention of economics as a discipline that's then telling the story about this thing called the economy. But it turns out that the concept of the environment is invented at the very same time. And I think that it's important that we see that the environment as a concept, the idea that we have an environment, I mean, the common idea is that somewhere out there there's an environment that's important to us and we have to save it or protect it. That the environment too is a product of that same colonial, industrial, capitalist history. So that's why I want to say that the economy and the environment are both the sort of alienated forms of our livelihood. And in our work, we need to start radically rethinking how we're using these categories and maybe even if we're going to use these categories. So if we're thinking of the economy as a box that we take capitalism out of and put something new into, we're actually still stuck inside the bigger box. That is the box that created the idea of the economy in the first place. As soon as we start talking about the economy, we're already dividing our lives up into categories that are cutting us apart. And we're setting ourselves up, economy versus environment conflicts, I mean, this whole thing is generated by the violence of the construction of those categories. The whole set of conflicts around identity politics versus economic politics, that whole thing is a setup that comes about because of the way we've constructed a notion of economy that's separate from a notion of society. So I want us to move from thinking about economic alternatives to think about alternatives to the economy. And for me, I think there are a number of ways to do that, and I don't know what the best way is. I think there are ways that we can redefine the word economy so that we mean that to be more like a sort of active verb and not a thing. I think that's also pretty confusing, given the ways that a lot of us have internalized what we think that word means. So this is where I want to experiment with the word livelihoods, because I've found that in Maine, at least, when I'm talking to all kinds of different people, I can use the language of livelihoods and very quickly get into a conversation where it's clear that we're not just talking about jobs, we're not just talking about capitalist employment and business, where we're not just talking about the economy. We can very quickly be talking about livelihoods in a way where, people know when we're talking about livelihoods, we're talking about all of the things that sustain us, all of the ways that we are sustained by others, all of the ways that we work to sustain ourselves, and all the ways that our labor contributes toward the sustenance of others. So I like to think of livelihoods as having these kind of three moments. So it's almost like instead of economy, society, and environment, I want to think livelihoods as what's happening. We're constituting livelihood. And that includes the production of our identities, our communities, our senses of belonging. It includes the ways we're providing goods and services and having those provided for us. It includes the ways we're sustained by non-human labor, so the labor of ecosystems. It includes the ways in which we're sustained by climate stability. And so in that sense, climate destabilization through climate change is absolutely a component of livelihoods, where in the other framework, it would be external to the economy. It might be something that the economy is provoking, but in conventional terms, it's an externality, right, to the economy. So livelihoods lets us talk in this more holistic way. And it opens up conversations about what actually sustains us. And immediately we know what sustains us is not just capitalism. And it's not just human. So there's no more environment there either. We're immediately in a space where we're recognizing non-human labor as a key part of our sustenance too. And then for me, the kind of ethical and political question then, because clearly our livelihoods are composed in all kinds of ways, some of which are incredibly oppressive and exploitative. It includes capitalism. It includes all kinds of modes of exploitation animated by white supremacy and patriarchy and heteronormativity. But we can then ask a question about livelihoods, which is the question about to what extent are we commoning our livelihoods? And so this word commoning is something that comes, the historian Peter Leinbach, who writes a lot about the history of commons and enclosures, he coined this term as a way he wanted to take some emphasis away from talking about the commons. Lots of people like to talk about the commons as sort of a pool of resources that are shared and managed collectively through a set of, collectively enforced rules. And he wanted to take emphasis away from that sort of very stable sense to talk about the process of making and sharing commons. And so a lot of people have now taken that up, that commons term. And within Community Economies Collective, a lot of us are really trying to use this language of commoning as a way of talking about the ethics and politics of how we make and share that which sustains us. So for me, commoning is about rendering the things that sustain us into spaces of democratic negotiation, where we're sustained by all these relationships and by all these forms of labor. But for many of us, those are spaces where we don't get to have a say in how they work, right? So that's the example of the capitalist workplace. But when we engage in a struggle to have a say, and the best forms of union struggle are exactly that, the best forms of workplace struggle. Worker cooperatives are that, instituted as a cooperative. We're commoning. We're commoning at that point of livelihood. We're saying we are going to claim our power to actually have a say in what sustains us. And when we take responsibility for the ways that we're sustained by others, and we say, the food that I'm eating is being produced by migrant farm workers who are currently being scapegoated by a white supremacist politics in the United States, I have a responsibility to actually be in solidarity with the people whose lives and labor are sustaining me. Right? And obviously that's not the only reason. I have a responsibility to be in solidarity with them, because that's my responsibility as a human being who wants to live in a world where people are not exploited and oppressed. Commoning is the name for what happens when, it's another word for solidarity in this case. It's the name for what happens when we build communities of shared responsibility for these relationships. So that's where anti-racist work, that's where food justice work, that's where climate justice work is all a form of commoning. It's all about us taking active responsibility in a collective way for the relations that sustain us, for the ways in which we're interdependent with each other. And that's in contrast with uncommoning. And I know I'm using this word in a sort of weird way. It's really just trying to play on commoning, but it's to say we're sustained by all these relationships, but some ways of organizing ourselves make that sustenance invisible, make it hard for us to actually negotiate and to actually build justice and real sustenance at those points, right? So capitalist commodity relationships are a perfect example of uncommoning. I buy food at a supermarket and I have no idea what the social and ecological relationships are that have produced that food. That's uncommoning. I can't take responsibility for those relations of interdependence. But the extent to which I'm actively involved in securing my food through means that are making that labor visible, that are building alliances of solidarity with those that are producing that food, that becomes an active form of commoning against the uncommoning of the capitalist commodity. So this for me is a way of thinking about politics that kind of allows us to connect a lot of different kinds of work together and to see all of that work as sort of different manifestations of really a process of radical democracy, of trying to radically democratize our sustenance in a collective way and democratize our forms of belonging and our forms of connection and community. So that's what I mean by commoning livelihoods, in contrast to uncommoning livelihoods.